It was November 1st, 1755, and an Anglican clergyman, Reverend Charles Davy, had just finished writing some letters. He later described that morning. There never was a finer morning seen than the 1st of November. The sun shone in all its full luster. The whole face of the sky was serene and clear, with not the least signal of warning of the approaching event. That event was the Great Earthquake of Lisbon, and it's one of the most important in the history of Europe. It not only changed the face of one of Europe's greatest cities, but it also transformed the politics and economics of the entire continent. It sparked entire new lines of philosophical inquiry during the Age of Enlightenment, and it caused the creation of a brand new science that is still developing today. It is history that deserves to be remembered. While the once vast Portuguese empire had been reduced significantly by the 18th century, in mid-century Portugal was still a world power, and its capital, Lisbon, a center of trade. A significant part of that had to do with the discovery of gold in Portugal's most lucrative remaining colony, Brazil, in the 1690s, followed by the discovery of diamonds in the 1720s. So many Portuguese immigrated to Brazil, as many as 400,000, for the gold rush that the country was deprived of labor, and King John V had to ban further immigration in 1709. The mines were also fed by the transatlantic slave trade, and some 500,000 Africans were kidnapped into slavery to work in the mines, as well as untold numbers of indigenous Indian slaves. The impacts of gold mining on the environment and demographics of Brazil were profound. The mines were lucrative, producing an estimated 350,000 ounces of gold a year. Officially, 1,000 metric tons of gold flowed into Portugal from the Brazilian mines in the 18th century, and that much again may have come in without being recorded. By some estimates, in the 18th century, 80% of the gold in Europe originated from Brazil. A significant amount of that went to the crown. The government levied a tax of 20% on all gold extracted, called the royal fifths. While collection of the tax was difficult, the penalty if caught evading the tax was to have all your gold confiscated, and revenues from confiscation exceeded revenues from the tax. In addition, an estimated 2.4 million carats of diamonds were imported from Brazil, which ruled the world diamond markets in the 18th century. The result was a great enrichment for the crown. Portuguese merchants also grew wealthy, providing goods such as cloth and metalwares, and of course, slaves obtained in Africa. Portugal was able to pay off debts from years of wars with the Dutch and British, and by mid-century, Portugal was thriving, and Lisbon, its capital and largest city, was a center of international trade. Lisbon is located at the mouth of the Tagus River, the longest river on the Iberian Peninsula. It has a spacious, protected natural harbor that has made it an important seaport and center for trade. With indications of permanent settlement as early as 2500 BC, Lisbon is among the oldest cities in Western Europe. At the turn of the 18th century, Lisbon was, by some accounts, the fifth largest city in Europe, larger than Rome or Madrid or Vienna. A late medieval city dominated by the Ribeira Palace, the 250-year-old main residence of the kings of Portugal, Lisbon in 1755 had a population of some 200,000. It was a city dominated by trade, as evidenced by the placement of the palace along the banks of the Tagus River, near the docks and shipyards. Ribeira Palace translates as Palace of the Riverside. Flush from Brazilian gold, King John V had expanded the palace and transformed its chapel into a massive Baroque church at the beginning of the century. His successor, Joseph I, had built the Royal Opera House attached to the palace in 1755. The opera had opened in March with an opera by composer Davide Perez. Much of the city was built using the distinct 16th century Portuguese Manueline style, named after King Emmanuel I. Lisbon was a devout Catholic city and had numerous cathedrals, monasteries, and 72 convents. The Church of Santa Engracia had been under construction since 1682, so long that Obras de Santa Engracia became the Portuguese term for never-ending construction project. Lisbon in 1755 was also a city of notorious wealth disparity, where the poor lived in terrible conditions, and so had a reputation for being dirty. November 1st was All Saints' Day, and much of the population of the city would have been at church. The royal family had celebrated a sunrise mass, but had left the city as one of the king's daughters wanted to spend the holiday on the coast. It was a bright, clear morning, and most of the population of Lisbon was celebrating mass. The first inkling of what was to come came at approximately 9:30 in the morning. Reverend Davy wrote, "I was sat down in my apartment, just finishing a letter, when the papers and table I was writing on began to tremble with a gentle motion, which rather surprised me, as I could not perceive a breath of wind stirring. Christian Stockaler, the consul of the German city of Hamburg, said, 'First we heard a rumble, like the noise of a carriage.' But then the noise grew. It became louder and louder until it was as loud as the loudest noise of a gun. Immediately after that, we felt the first tremble. At 9:40, all the church bells started ringing. Accounts vary, but the shaking lasted between 3 and 6 minutes. Modern estimates are that the quake had a magnitude between 8.5 to 9 using the moment magnitude scale, releasing, in essence, 1,000 times as much energy as the 2010 Haiti earthquake. The first great shock was felt over an area between 1.2 and 1.4 million square miles. The shaking was felt as far away as Finland and North Africa, northern Italy, and the Azores in the mid-Atlantic. According to author Mark Mulsky, the earthquake released 475 megatons of energy, the equivalent of 32,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. He noted in an interview with National Public Radio in 2015 that it was the largest earthquake to hit Europe in the last 10,000 years. Davy observed that with regard to the buildings, it was observed that the solidest in general fell the first. Massive stone structures have little flexibility to absorb shock. The churches and cathedrals full of parishioners collapsed on themselves, crushing the people inside. The sky became as dark as night from the clouds of dust and debris. A significant aftershock hit around 10, and more buildings crumbled. The streets were full of people and animals, trapped or killed by falling rubble. Many, including Reverend Davy, headed for the docks, where they would be relatively safe from debris. There they beheld a bewildering sight. The Tagus River had receded. They could see the river bottom, littered with old shipwrecks. The people had no idea how to interpret this. Tsunamis in the Atlantic are exceedingly rare. Some people even ventured down, hoping to retrieve treasure from the wrecked ships. The tsunami hit at approximately 10 after 10. A wave 12 meters, nearly 40 feet high, came in, as the Reverend described it, like a mountain. So fast that by multiple accounts, people on horseback trying to outrun it had to gallop at full speed. The tidal waves raced up the course of the river and swept away the docks and at least hundreds of people who had sought refuge there. Reverend Davy narrowly escaped, holding onto a huge fallen beam. The water rushed back and then came again, 2 more times. The tsunami was huge. Waves as high as 20 meters hit the coast of Morocco, where as many as 10,000 people were killed. 3-meter waves hit the coast of England and Ireland, enough to cause damage. 4-meter waves hit islands in the Caribbean. And, a careful review of records reveals, the tsunami reached the coast of Brazil. The smoke was rising even before the waves receded. The city had been lit by candle and lamp, and thousands of candles had been lit for All Saints' Day. The rubble began to burn. Many fires joined into a single blaze, burning the parts of the city that had survived the earthquake and tsunami, and killing those trapped in the rubble. The fire raged for 5 days, creating a firestorm, a fire so bad that it creates its own wind. It sucked up so much air that people 100 yards from the blaze asphyxiated. The destruction was terrible. Among the buildings burned to the ground were the Royal Hospital of All Saints, the largest hospital in Portugal, where hundreds of patients were killed in the blaze. The Opera House was in ruins, the Ribera Palace gutted, and with it was lost the 70,000-volume Royal Library, with hundreds of priceless works of art. Original manuscripts and details of early Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama were lost. So many records were lost that the entire history of the nation was truncated. The British Special Envoy to the King of Portugal, Abraham Casters, later wrote that the fire has done 10 times more mischief than the earthquake itself. The assessments of the damage vary. Conservative estimates are that 10% of the structures in the city were destroyed outright, and at least 2/3 of the buildings throughout the city so damaged as to be uninhabitable. Other estimates assert that as much as 85 to 90% of the buildings in the city were destroyed. Reverend Davy described the city. Every parish church, convent, nunnery, palace, and public edifice, with an infinite number of private houses, were either thrown down or so miserably shattered that it was rendered dangerous to pass by them. Castor's letter to England described this opulent city, now reduced to a heap of rubbish and ruins. Davy quoted a contemporary estimate of 60,000 dead, although those estimates may be exaggerated. And Lisbon was not the only city affected, with significant damage throughout southern Portugal and North Africa. The scope of the damage was a shock in the Age of Enlightenment, and the implications discussed throughout the continent. Religious thinkers saw the catastrophe as a repudiation of the science of the age, and asserted that it was a divine punishment, coming as it did on an important feast day, and laying waste to all the great cathedrals of the city, which, ironically, were more prone to destruction, as the city center was built on sedimentary soil that was more subject to the process of liquefaction. Protestant writers described it as retribution for the Portuguese Inquisition, and Catholic writers saw it as God's rage against the free thinkers and atheists living in the Portuguese capital city, sparking backlash against foreigners like the mostly Protestant British. Priests and monks stood in the streets screaming for people to repent, adding to the panic. The great philosopher Voltaire found the divine punishment idea ridiculous, asking, why Lisbon? Is Lisbon worse than other cities? Is there more sin and evil in Lisbon than in Paris or London? Instead, he used it to attack the philosophy of optimism, represented by people like English poet Alexander Pope, who asserted that everything happens for good, arguing instead that the existence of evil is a fact that must be accepted. Jean-Jacques Rousseau saw it as a repudiation of large cities, and saw it as a call to go back to nature. But another reaction was unique. While small numbers of scholars had discussed such disasters as natural events in the past, in the Age of Enlightenment, with a greater idea to publish ideas, for the first time earthquakes were seen widely as natural phenomena to be studied, an idea that challenged the foundation of the power of the Church in Europe. Unfortunately, these discussions were mostly fruitless. Immanuel Kant supposed that volcanic action was due to the subterranean combination of sulfur and iron. Other hypotheses had to do with air circulation in the crust of the Earth, tremors as a result of electric discharge, or the spontaneous explosion of gases in the underground. The discussion of earthquakes as a natural phenomena with scientific explanation was a tectonic shift in itself, but the theorists of the day could not envision plate tectonics, and their discussion provided little understanding. Estimates are that the earthquake cost Portugal the equivalent of almost half of their gross domestic product, sped the decline of their empire. By the end of the 18th century, the empire that had been described as the world's first global empire was a tiny shadow of itself, transforming Europe and the world forever. King Joseph I considered it a miracle that his family had escaped the earthquake, but he became claustrophobic and paranoid of walls. The royal court was moved into a group of tents on a hillside, and the royal family never moved back to Roberta Palace. Although there was enough of the structure left to rebuild, the 2.5-century-old palace of the kings of Portugal was demolished. Joseph was never much interested in governing, and after the earthquake he gave his prime minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, complete power, making him the Marquês de Pombal. Ruling as a de facto king, Pombal took many steps following the earthquake, organizing firefighters to extinguish the blaze, restoring law and order by hanging looters, using the army to keep the people from abandoning the city as they needed them to rebuild, moving quickly to dispose of the bodies of the dead to prevent disease, and rebuilding the city on a new, modern plan that included new architecture known as the Pombaline style, that was some of the first construction ever built to resist earthquakes using flexible wooden structure. Using his power, Pombal engaged in numerous reforms, but also used that power to attack his enemies, becoming a virtual dictator. Perhaps most importantly, Pombal sent throughout the country a series of detailed questions about the earthquake. What time it happened, how long it shook, what direction it came from, what direction buildings fell, when the tsunami hit, how tall the tsunami was. And that data allowed a scientific reconstruction of the event, and thus is seen as the foundation of the science of seismology, the scientific study of earthquakes. And that discipline still today continues to try to understand and predict seismic events and mitigate their effects. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.